Welcome to our deep dive into atomic habits. We're going to be using James Clear's book as our guide today to uncover the science behind building better habits. You'll learn how those tiny tweaks that you make each day can actually snowball into huge changes over time, and just as importantly, how to make those changes stick.
It's amazing how often we dismiss the power of small actions. We grab a cookie without a second thought or hit snooze one more time. But these seemingly insignificant choices can have a compounding effect. They're like tiny deposits or withdrawals from your habit bank account.
I like that analogy. It reminds me of Clear's point about the 1% rule, how even a tiny improvement each day for a year can lead to almost 38 times the results. Imagine applying that to, say, learning a new language or mastering a musical instrument.
Think about Olympic athletes. They don't become world-class overnight. It's the accumulation of those tiny improvements. A fraction of a second shaved off their time, an extra degree of precision in their movements. That makes all the difference.
So if you're listening, think about this. What small change could you make today that would set you on a path towards your goals? Now let's unpack how those habits actually form. Clear breaks it down into 4 stages. Cue, craving, response, and reward.
It's like a neurological loop. The cue is a trigger. Anything that signals your brain to initiate a behavior. You walk into the kitchen and see a bowl of fruit on the counter. That's your cue.
But is it really just seeing the fruit, or is there something deeper going on?
That's where craving comes in. It's not just wanting the fruit. It's your brain anticipating the reward associated with it. Maybe you're craving the sweetness or the vitamins or even just the satisfying crunch. That anticipation fuels the next stage.
Which is the response, the actual habit itself. You reach for a piece of fruit, take a bite.
But there's one more stage, right?
The reward, the payoff that reinforces the entire cycle. You enjoy the taste of the fruit, and your brain files that away. Next time you see that bowl of fruit, the entire loop is more likely to fire. That's how habits become automatic. This makes me think about bad habits, those unwanted behaviors that seem to stick around no matter what. How can we break free from those patterns?
Clear Bearers argues that lasting change doesn't start with willpower or forcing yourself to do things you hate. Instead, it's about shifting your identity, who you believe you are at your core.
So instead of saying, I want to eat healthier, I should be saying, I am a healthy person. Does that really work?
It's about aligning your actions with the image you have of yourself. Imagine someone who sees themselves as a runner. They're more likely to lace up their shoes even on a rainy day because it reinforces that identity.
Okay, but how do we actually make that shift? How do we start seeing ourselves as that healthier, more disciplined person?
It's a process, and it starts with proving to yourself that you are capable of becoming that person. Clear uses a powerful example of a man who quit smoking by systematically reframing each cigarette break.
Reframing. So instead of seeing it as a moment of relaxation,
He recognized it as a moment of self-deception. He literally told himself, stop lying. You don't enjoy this. You don't want this. He detached the positive association from the cue and replaced it with a negative one.
So he essentially rewired his brain to associate smoking with something unpleasant, breaking the reward cycle. But what about building good habits? How do we make those stick?
That's where Clear's 4 laws of behavior change come in. They're incredibly practical strategies for making good habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying.
I'm ready to dive into those laws. Let's start with making good habits obvious. How do we bring those out of the shadows?
One strategy is habit stacking. You link a new habit to an existing one, something you already do automatically. For instance, after I pour my morning coffee, I'll meditate for 1 minute.
I actually do something similar. After I brush my teeth, I do 10 push-ups. It's like sneaking in a workout without even thinking about it. But what about making habits attractive? We all have those things we know we should do, but just don't feel like doing.
Clear suggests a technique called temptation bundling, where you pair an activity you want to do with one you need to do. Think of it as giving yourself permission to enjoy something you love, but only while doing something you've been avoiding.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Let's say you love binge watching your favorite show, but you also know you need to start exercising more. You could make a rule. You only watch the show while walking on the treadmill. Suddenly, exercise becomes a lot more appealing.
That's brilliant. It's like tricking your brain into craving something healthy.
Exactly. You're leveraging your brain's reward system to your advantage. But it's not just about making habits attractive. We also need to make them easy.
So less thinking, more doing.
Right. Clear's 2-minute rule is fantastic for this. It basically says when starting a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do.
So instead of aiming for a 30-minute workout, I should just focus on putting on my workout clothes. That seems almost too simple.
It is simple. And that's the point. Once you've overcome that initial inertia, you're far more likely to keep going. You've broken the barrier to entry, and you're already moving in the right direction.
I love that. It's like giving yourself permission to start small and build momentum. Okay, we've covered obvious, attractive, and easy. What about the fourth law, making habits satisfying?
Our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. We're more likely to repeat behaviors that feel good and avoid those that feel bad. That's where reward systems come in.
So give ourselves a pat on the back. Celebrate those small wins.
Exactly. But Clear takes it a step further. He emphasizes immediate rewards, especially when dealing with bad habits that offer instant gratification. We need to make those healthy choices, the ones that pay off in the long run, feel more satisfying in the moment. One way to do that is through habit tracking. Using a visual tracker, whether it's an app or a simple calendar, helps you see your progress, which can be surprisingly motivating. It's almost like playing a game. You don't want to break your winning streak.
And that visual reminder ties back to the idea of identity, right? Every time you mark off a day, you're reinforcing the belief that you are the kind of person who follows through. But isn't there a risk of becoming too reliant on external rewards? What happens when those rewards go away?
That's an important question, and it brings us to a crucial point: the power of environment.
You mean the physical space we inhabit, the people we surround ourselves with? How does that tie into all of this?
Our environment is constantly shaping our behavior, often without us realizing it. It can trigger our habits, both good and bad. Claire highlights this with a fascinating story about the Vietnam War heroin epidemic. During the war, nearly 20% of American soldiers were addicted to heroin.
That's a staggering number. But I'm guessing there's a twist to this story.
There is. When these soldiers returned to the United States, the relapse rate was less than 5%.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So what happened? Did they all magically kick the habit just by coming home?
Researchers believe the change in environment played a significant role. In Vietnam, the soldiers were surrounded by cues that triggered their drug use: stress, boredom, easy access to heroin. Back home, those cues were largely gone.
So their environment was enabling their addiction.
Exactly. And the reverse is also true. We can design our surroundings to make good habits more obvious and accessible while making bad habits invisible and inconvenient. If you want to eat healthier, keep a bowl of fruit on your counter instead of a jar of cookies.
Out of sight, out of mind. Or in this case, insight, top of mind.
Precisely. It's about making the desired choice the easiest one.
This has been so insightful. It's amazing how much control we have over our habits when we understand how they work. We've covered a lot of ground: the 4 stages of habit formation, the 4 laws of behavior change, and the power of environment. But there's one key element we haven't touched on yet: the 2-minute rule.
Ah, yes, the 2-minute rule. That's a powerful tool for overcoming procrastination and building momentum. But we'll have to say that for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into atomic habits. We're picking up right where we left off, talking about the 2-minute rule, this brilliant hack for making it easier to start new habits.
It's all about reducing that initial friction,
Yeah.
that resistance we often feel when faced with a new challenge. Think about it. Starting is often the hardest part.
It's so true. My brain always seems to come up with a million excuses to avoid doing the things I know I should be doing.
But that's where the 2-minute rule comes in. It helps you outsmart your brain's tendency to overcomplicate things. Instead of saying, I'm going to write a novel, you say, I'm going to sit down and write one sentence.
One sentence.
Yeah.
That feels so much more manageable, even on those days when I'm feeling completely uninspired.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Once you've taken that first step, often the momentum carries you forward. You end up writing a paragraph, then a page, and before you know it, you're lost in the flow of writing.
It's like that feeling of getting into a groove, where you're so absorbed in what you're doing that time seems to fly by.
Clear actually talks about the Goldilocks rule, which is closely related to this. Is the idea that we're most motivated when working on tasks that are right on the edge of our current abilities. Not too hard, not too easy, but just right.
So finding that sweet spot is key to staying engaged and motivated, but how do we actually find that balance?
It's a process of experimentation. You need to be willing to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, but also be honest about your current skill level. Think of it like a video game. If you're playing a level that's way too easy, you get bored. But if it's too difficult, you get frustrated and give up.
So we need to constantly challenge ourselves, but not to the point where we become overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's about finding that optimal level of challenge that keeps you engaged and wanting to come back for more.
This reminds me of something we touched on earlier, the importance of embracing boredom. It seems counterintuitive, but maybe there's something to be said for pushing through those moments when we don't feel particularly inspired.
Absolutely. Clear shares this great anecdote about an elite weightlifting coach who emphasized the importance of being able to handle the monotony of daily training. He said one of the biggest differences between the best athletes and everyone else wasn't passion or talent. It was the willingness to show up and do the work, even when it wasn't exciting.
So consistency trumps intensity.
Exactly. It's those small, consistent efforts day after day that lead to mastery. And that brings us back to the importance of making those habits as easy and satisfying as possible, so we're more likely to stick with them even when the initial enthusiasm fades.
Okay, so we've talked about habit trackers and reward systems, but are there other ways to make those good habits more satisfying in the moment?
One approach is to focus on the intrinsic rewards of the habit itself. For example, if you're trying to establish a meditation practice, you might start to notice that you feel calmer and more focused throughout the day.
So it's about tuning into those subtle benefits that might not be immediately obvious.
Exactly. It's about shifting your focus from the long-term goal to the positive feelings you experience in the present moment. Another powerful approach is to find a sense of community or accountability.
You mean joining a group of like-minded people who are working towards similar goals?
Right. Having that social support can make a huge difference, especially when you're facing challenges. It's easier to stay motivated when you know you're not alone.
And there's also the element of accountability, right? Knowing that others are expecting you to show up can help you stay on track.
Absolutely. But sometimes, even with the best intentions and the most supportive environment, we still struggle to stick to our habits. And that's where it's important to remember that slip-ups are inevitable.
So we shouldn't beat ourselves up if we miss a day or two.
Exactly. The key is to not let a small setback derail your entire progress. Clear emphasizes the importance of getting back on track as quickly as possible. He calls it the never miss twice rule.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about recognizing that we're all human and that perfection is not the goal.
Right? It's about progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
And speaking of progress, one of the most powerful ways to create lasting change is by understanding the impact of our environment on our habits.
We talked about this briefly in the last part, but can you remind us why environment is so important, especially for someone who's trying to break a bad habit or build a good one?
It's about recognizing that our habits are not formed in a vacuum. They're shaped by the context in which they occur, by the cues and rewards that are present in our surroundings.
So if we want to change our behavior, we need to change our environment. Is that what you're saying?
In a nutshell, yes. It's about being intentional in designing an environment that supports the habits we want to cultivate and discourages the ones we want to eliminate.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But how do we actually do that? Do we need to move to a new city, redesign our entire house? What are some practical steps we can take?
It doesn't have to be that drastic. Small changes can make a big difference. Clear shares this great example of a man who was struggling with late-night snacking. He realized that he was mindlessly grabbing chips and cookies from the pantry every time he walked by.
Oh, I know that struggle all too well. What did he do to break that habit?
He simply started keeping a bowl of fruit on his kitchen counter instead. By making the healthy choice the most visible and convenient option, he was able to significantly reduce his late-night snacking.
It's amazing how those small tweaks can have such a big impact. But what about when it comes to breaking bad habits? How do we make those unwanted behaviors less appealing?
One strategy Clear recommends is to increase the friction, to make it more difficult to engage in the bad habit. For example, if you're trying to reduce your social media use, try deleting those apps from your phone or logging out of your accounts.
So it's about creating those extra steps, those little barriers that make it less likely you'll give in to temptation.
Exactly. You're essentially increasing the activation energy required to engage in the habit. And you can also use your environment to make good habits more attractive.
Can you give me an example of that?
Let's say you want to start reading more. Instead of keeping your books tucked away on a shelf, try creating a cozy reading nook with a comfortable chair, good lighting, and maybe even a blanket.
I love that. It's like inviting yourself to spend time with a good book.
Exactly. It's about creating a space that makes you feel relaxed, focused, and ready to dive into a good story.
This is all starting to make so much sense. It's like we have this incredible power to shape our habits and ultimately our lives by designing our environment in a way that supports our goals. But we've been focusing a lot on personal habits. Can these principles be applied to other areas of life, like building a successful business or raising well-rounded children?
Absolutely. The principles of habit formation are universal. They can be applied to any area of life where you're trying to create positive change.
I'm so curious to explore those applications.
We can definitely dive into those in the next and final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
We're wrapping up our exploration of atomic habits.
And we're kind of shifting gears a bit to see how these principles apply beyond just our personal lives.
Yeah, we've been focusing mostly on individual habits, but these concepts can be just as powerful in a team setting a family dynamic or even an entire organization.
So let's start with business. How can leaders use these insights to build a more productive and engaged workforce?
One key takeaway is the importance of clarity. Clear emphasizes that. Too often, companies set these vague goals, or they rely on motivational speeches that don't actually translate into action.
So it's not enough to just tell employees to, work harder or be more innovative?
Exactly. It's about creating systems that make it clear what needs to be done, make those actions appealing to do, make sure it's easy to actually get started, and ensure it's satisfying to follow through. Just like with personal habits, the same principles apply to building a thriving company culture.
Can you give an example of how a company might put these principles into practice?
Sure. Let's say a company wants to improve its customer service. Instead of just telling employees to be nicer to customers, they could create a system that rewards employees for going above and beyond. Think bonuses, recognition programs, or even just a sincere thank you from leadership.
So making it satisfying to provide excellent service.
Precisely. And they could also make it easier for employees to access the resources they need to do their jobs well, whether that's clear guidelines, training programs, or even just a more supportive and collaborative team environment.
It's about setting people up for success, right? Removing those barriers to good habits. But what about the attractive part? How can a company make even the less glamorous tasks more appealing?
That's where you had to get a little creative. Maybe you tie those tasks to a sense of purpose, highlight the impact they have on the bigger picture, or even introduce some friendly competition to make it more engaging.
Okay, now let's talk about parenting. As a parent myself, I'm always looking for ways to raise kids who thrive. How do these principles play out in the world of family and child development?
Well, one of the most important things parents can do is create an environment that supports healthy habits. We've talked about how our surroundings shape our behavior, and that's especially true for children. They're like sponges, absorbing the cues and patterns they see around them.
So it's not just about telling our kids to eat their vegetables or do their homework. It's about creating a home where those behaviors are encouraged and rewarded.
Exactly.
Right.
Think about it this way. If you want your kids to read more, make sure there are books easily accessible throughout the house. Maybe even create a cozy reading nook. If you want them to be more active, provide opportunities for play and movement. Maybe sign them up for a sport or dance class. It's about making those good habits the most appealing and convenient options.
I love that. Instead of constantly nagging or lecturing, we can actually design our homes and routines to nudge our kids towards those healthy behaviors.
And remember, children are always watching us. If we want them to develop good habits, we need to model those behaviors ourselves.
So lead by example. If we're constantly glued to our phones, we can't really expect our kids to prioritize reading or spending time outdoors.
Exactly. Our actions speak louder than words, and children are incredibly perceptive. They're constantly picking up on our habits, both good and bad. What we do is far more influential than what we say.
This has been such an insightful conversation. It's amazing to see how these seemingly simple principles of habit formation can be applied to so many different areas of life. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the power of identity. We talked about how it plays a role in building personal habits. But how can we use this knowledge to become better versions of ourselves in all areas of our lives?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think the key is to remember that our identity is not fixed. It's a story we tell ourselves, and we have the power to rewrite that story. It's an ongoing process of growth and evolution.
So it's not about who we are today, but who we choose to become.
Exactly. And that choice is reflected in the habits we cultivate, the actions we take each day. Every small choice, every tiny step contributes to the larger narrative of who we're becoming.
That's such a powerful thought. It's not about striving for some unattainable ideal of perfection, but rather embracing the journey of becoming a little bit better each day.
I completely agree. And that journey doesn't have to be overwhelming. It's about focusing on those small atomic changes, those tiny tweaks to our habits and routines that can have a ripple effect over time.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the world of atomic habits. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools to create positive change in my life, my work, and even my family. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Knowing that environment plays such a crucial role in shaping our habits, what's one small change you can make to your surroundings today to make a desired habit more obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying? It could be as simple as rearranging your desk, setting out your workout clothes the night before, or even just placing a bowl of fruit on your kitchen counter. What small step can you take today to set yourself up for success?
It's a powerful question to consider. Remember, even the tiniest changes can make a world of difference.
That's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the transformative power of atomic habits. We hope you'll take these insights and start building a life that's a little bit better, one small habit at a time.